Great, thank you, and welcome everybody to the Indonesia update of our 2021 Politics in Action. My name's Thashara Dibley, and I'm one of the Deputy Directors at the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre. Just before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to acknowledge that the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre is on just get you to change the slide, the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and we just like to pay our respects to elders past and present who've cared and continue to care for country. So our speaker today is Dr. Burhanuddin Muhtadi from the Syarif Hidayatullah State Islamic University in Jakarta. Dr. Muhtadi is also the Executive Director of the Indonesian Political Indicator and the Director of Public Affairs at the Indonesian Survey Institute. His research interests include political Islam, voting behavior, clientelism, democracy, and social movements. Dr. Muhtadi will be speaking for 15 minutes, and during that time, if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A. We'll have 10 minutes at the end for him to answer any questions. So, Dr. Muhtadi, please go ahead.
Thank you, Thashara. Hello, everyone. My name is Burhanuddin Muhtadi. I'm Senior Lecturer at State Islamic University in Jakarta and Executive Director of Indonesian Political Indicator. Thank you for having me. I'm so honored to be invited for Politics in Action 2021 and so thrilled to share some updates on key political development in Indonesia. And specifically, I would like to talk about COVID-19 and Jokowi's second term agenda, political consolidation amidst public health crisis. There is almost no significant difference between the main agenda of Jokowi's first and second term. So the economy remained his first priority for his last term as a president. The game-changing factor comes in the form of constitutional term limit. So just before he was sworn in as president for the second term, Jokowi said that he will not have any burden because he cannot run again in 2024. However, this without burden statement should be understood in the context of economic reform. Jokowi is more courageous in carrying out unpopular economic policies to fulfill the commitment to the economic reform. For example, Jokowi enacted the job creation law, commonly known as Omnibus Law, to attract investment and create new jobs despite huge demonstration from labor union and students. But when it comes to democratic reform and human rights, Jokowi has shown little interest. In the first term, Jokowi still had electoral incentive to show concern for the most trusted law enforcement institution, KPK, but the incentive disappeared along with his inauguration as the second term president. Although Jokowi cannot run again, his coalition parties still need to compete in the next legislative election. While Jokowi might ignore the demonstration when launching controversial policies, his coalition can overlook such protests because they still need to get a vote in the next election. So, to anticipate of defection from his coalitional parties, Jokowi added Gerindra, his long-time rival Prabowo's party, in his coalition. And because a lot of political accommodation, Jokowi's second term cabinet was like a mix, the good, the bad, and the ugly politician and professional. So everything was running as planned until COVID-19 hit Indonesia in March 2020. The pandemic not only brought a devastating public health crisis, but also was expected to undermine Jokowi's plan. Let alone during a pandemic which was marred by economic recession, during normal period of stable economic condition, it would have been difficult to carry out Jokowi's second term objective. And indeed, as you can see from this screen, in the early 6 months of the outbreak, the economy was badly affected. The majority of the public felt that the economic condition in mid-2020 was perceived bad or very bad. You can see from this slide, 81% said so, and rating was the worst in our public opinion survey 16 years back. Jokowi's responses to the pandemic by prioritizing the economy over public health have bit by bit produced positive outcomes so far. So in the late 2020, Indonesia started to witness good sign of economic recovery indicated by an increase in the household consumption, investment, and export performance. And the recovery is also evident from the economic growth. Just PPS released that in the first quarter 2021, the Indonesia economic growth minus 0.7%. It means that Indonesia began to move toward a better direction after Indonesia experienced the deepest contraction last year. Despite its slow and poor responses to the spread of pandemic, Indonesia is surprisingly among countries that have managed the COVID death rate low. By comparing the death rate with GDP data, it turns out that Indonesian performance in protecting people's health and the economy was relatively good according to our world data. Of course, it is too early to say whether Indonesia will emerge unscathed from the pandemic, given that many factors have affected the death rate and the shock to the economy beyond the policy decision made by the government. And of course, the full impact of the outbreak are yet to be seen. Many economists, however, have expressed optimism that Indonesian economy is returning to growth in 2021, with the vaccination program is underway. Respected institutions such as the World Bank, IMF project the Indonesian economy in 2021 will be positive in the range 4 to 5%. Unsurprisingly, again, if you look at this trend, more respondents in our survey in April 2021 believe that Jokowi had performed better. So if we look at this graph, even the massive blow to the economy last year, although slightly weakened, didn't seem to shake the public perception of the government so much. In addition, Jokowi's performance in handling COVID-19 was also strongly influenced by partisan attitudes. The Z case of political polarization era has also helped Jokowi in entrenching his supporters' loyal support, some even say bordering on fanaticism, which oftentimes disregard the substance of his administration policies, while at the same time shielding it from his detractors' criticism. Jokowi's indifference toward democratic reform, followed by strong determination to immediately restore the post-pandemic economy, has made him increasingly frequent to undertake a more authoritarian approach. So for him, in the midst of crisis due to the pandemic, political stability and economic growth can be pursued at the cost of individual freedom. In early 2020, for instance, Jokowi asked the police and state intelligence agency to approach labor union and civil society organizations and persuade them to support the government's controversial omnibus bill. As argued by Greg Philly from the Australian National University, this greater involvement of the military, police, and intelligence in social and political affairs comes at a time when state intimidation of government critics has reached the highest level of the post-Suharto period. That's why Indonesian ranking on the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index 2020, in the left side of this slide, reached lowest level in 14 years. So the nation recorded an overall score 6.3, down from 6.48 in 2019. It was now classified as flawed democracy. It is true that before the pandemic, Indonesian democracy was already at its lowest point, but the outbreak has dragged it down further. So Indonesia has also gone backward on index of corruption after almost 20 years of making consistent progress. The latest report by Transparency International show that Indonesia has slipped 70 places to 102 in perception index. But all this hasn't dampened Jokowi's plan to continue pursuing his ambition, including on the development on the new capital in East Kalimantan province, despite the sputtering pandemic hit economy. While many have suggested that Jokowi should postpone the plan, he believed that the new capital project will boost foreign investment and stimulate the economy. Jokowi tested support for the nomination of his son Gibran and son-in-law Bobby in mayoral election last year, also shows his high level of confidence. Despite harsh criticism from the public that Jokowi is building a political dynasty, he insisted that Gibran and Bobi have their right as citizens who run as mayoral candidates. Also, the collapse of the election and local election bill revision in the House of Representatives was another unambiguous sign of Jokowi's success in consolidating his power in the midst of pandemic under the pretext of the need for more robust central government to deal with public health crisis at hand. The revision that has been planned and worked on for a year by all factions in DPR, including parties supporting the government, had to be cancelled because Jokowi suddenly had another desire. The value of the revision will lift 272 provinces and regencies whose regional heads have reached their office term limit in 2022-2023 without definitive leaders. So the president and then the home minister will then have the prerogative to appoint acting regional head until simultaneous local election will be held in November 2024, just after Jokowi ends his presidency in October. In addition, with the collapse of election bill revision, parties required to attend 20% of the seat in the DPR or 20% of the national vote to be able to nominate a presidential candidate in 2024. Jokowi's centrality as the locus of political power has resulted in the phenomenon of one-party rule, in which many political parties have similar political stances following the president leads. This succinctly explains why the revision of the election bill failed. Not only that, in many ways, including even for controversial policies such as omnibus law, all political parties supporting the government agreed to support Jokowi's agenda. In the matter of sharing power with supporting parties, Jokowi is no different from previous president, but there are still visible differences compared to the previous presidential administration phenomena, in which the president was oftentimes held hostage by his supporting parties. During Jokowi's presidential rule, it is often the case it is not the party that controls the president, but quite the opposite. President Jokowi held the reign on the governing party coalition members so that even unpopular policies proposed by Jokowi can still pass in the DPR. So Jokowi's threatening power raised concern regarding the idea of extending the presidential term. Indeed, Jokowi repeatedly said that he doesn't want to add his presidential term and reject an amendment to the constitution, which now limits the presidential term to 2 periods. However, if it is true that Jokowi rejects the idea of extending the presidential term, why he let his allies to play this issue several times? For example, Jokowi's top ally, the chairman of his coalition party, Nasdem, Surya Paloh, said recently that he was open to the possibility of amending constitution so that Jokowi can be elected for a third time. In conclusion, even though the COVID-19 pandemic has clearly disrupted Jokowi's second-term agenda in launching a more visionary project and securing a monumental legacy, Jokowi successfully managed to maintain high public trust. Not only that, Jokowi has also succeeded in consolidating power in parliament to support his economic and political agendas. So we can argue that the public's diverted focus on ongoing public health and economic crisis due to COVID-19 pandemic has been inadvertently exploited by the administration to push through his agenda without much public scrutiny under normal situation. I will stop my presentation. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. We have about 12 minutes or so to answer some questions, and we've had a few questions come through. in the chat here. So one of the first ones was around the perception of how COVID-19 has affected public perception of the military, and has the military moved to consolidate power before the end of Jokowi's term?
Yeah, thank you to Sarah. So basically, the military has been trusted by Indonesian public even before the pandemic. So and now, if we look at the trend, the level of trust toward military is among the highest. That's happened before the pandemic. So even before the pandemic, TNI or military is the most trusted institution in Indonesia. This is quite surprising if we look at the trend, especially after the collapse of Suharto at the time. TNI was among the lowest trusted institution, but now, since 2007 until now, TNI is among the most trusted institution, and that's happened even before the.
All right, well, we'll skip over to another COVID-19 related question. So there's a question here about how reliable you think the data, COVID-19 data in Indonesia is in terms of cases and deaths, given the low levels of testing. And do you think that there's the risk of a new wave in Indonesia, like what is happening in India now?
Yeah, basically, many people suspect that the data provided by the government not really reliable, especially because Indonesia have a very low level of testing and tracing. But in terms of death, I think everyone cannot hide, those people who died because of COVID. So I just remember my foreign journalist once investigated the number of deaths, especially in Bali, and he found that it's true that the number of deaths in Bali was increasing, but not really dramatic. So in terms of the data provided by our word in data or Johns Hopkins University, I think the measurement used by them are quite biased. Why biased? Because they use two measurements, GDP data and cumulative number of confirmed COVID-19 deaths per million. The latter measurement, namely death rate per million people, is biased toward the age composition, Tusara. Why? Because Indonesian people mostly coming from younger people. So 70% of Indonesian population is young, the group of 40 years and under. And if we compare with, Sweden or European countries, elderly people in European countries that are more vulnerable, to be affected by COVID is around 20%. That's that's over the world average of elderly people, around 16 years people. So basically, Indonesia is lucky because we have so many young people. So the number of people who died from COVID relatively low. The second, from the economic point of view, Indonesian economic is basically domestically oriented. So that's why Indonesian economy not really affected by the global shock due to the pandemic. So again, this is because we are lucky. So and at the same time, the contribution of agriculture for economy in Indonesia is still quite big. While in fact, the agricultural sector is not too affected by the pandemic. So our weaknesses now become strength in terms of the pandemic.
All right, I'm going to switch to some questions that are more directly linked to politics. Someone has posted the question, you mentioned that Jokowi's approval rating has been quite good over the last year. Could you comment on the impact of changes to law on the KPK on the popularity of Jokowi and the parliament? And could we say from your statistics that it hasn't had much effect?
Yeah, so this is a worrying trend in Indonesia based on our latest surveys. We found that people not really concerned on corruption as many as we found in previous years. So, and at the same time, Jokowi really smart when it comes to discussion on KPK law revision. He just blamed to the parliament. Well, in fact, the pass of the KPK law revision basically from the two sides, from the government and from the parliament. So now people just only care about the economy. And while the economy is getting better, indicated by, as I mentioned earlier, the economic growth and then the household consumption, people now, back to support Jokowi. But even during the pandemic, Tushara, last year, surprisingly, the level of trust with Jokowi is still over 60%. So I suspect because the public satisfaction with Jokowi, including how Jokowi is handling in the pandemic, is influenced by partisan attitudes. So those who voted for Jokowi and K. Maruf tend to be satisfied with Jokowi's handling of pandemic, while those who voted for Prabowo and Sandi, despite the fact that the two now a part of coalition, tend to dissatisfied with Jokowi. So these partisan attitudes really help Jokowi. So even during the massive blow to the economy last year, he still kept 60%. Now around 71.9% is very high. And I think this is why I mentioned in my presentation, he quite confident now. He successfully consolidated his power even during the pandemic because he believed that he can handle the pandemic, and at the same time, he still believed that he can maintain his public trust.
So we have time for one final question, and thank you to everyone who's posted questions, and I'm sorry we haven't been able to address them all. So just in the final few minutes, if you could address the question from Rosa Evacuata. You mentioned at the end of the talk that building on extending the presidential term to a third, so you mentioned the possibility of Jokowi extending his presidential term to a third term, considering the history of how difficult and chaotic the previous 4 amendments to the Constitution have been. How likely do you think that this is, going to become a reality?
Yeah. So basically, if we look at, coalition parties that support Jokowi now, it's very big. Maybe Jokowi will add another party to be included in the government, namely National Mandate Party PAN. So based on the latest development, it is possible for Jokowi to amend the constitution in order to add his presidential term. But the question is, whether the support for this idea of extending president's term automatically supported by his political parties, because there are two things that I would like to mention, Tushara. The first is it depends on public opinion. So far, most respondents reject the extension of presidential term. So this is the idea is not really popular because this contradicts with the reformasi spirit. And my survey data in April, 43% of respondents knew about the idea of extending presidential term, but most of them, 71% of them, refused to extend the presidential term. So Jokowi and his allies, of course, will take into account this public opinion because they don't want to be alienated by the public. And the second, several parties also have their own electoral agendas because they want to advance their own cadre as presidential or vice presidential candidate for 2024 election. For example, Gerindra, of course, they want to nominate their chairman, Prabowo, or Golkar. They just want to advance Airlangga, the chairman, as the candidate for 2024 in order to increase the chance to increase the electability of their political parties. So basically the support for this idea of extending presidential term coming from those parties who do not have well-known figure that can be nominated as presidential candidate and feel that they now enjoy the status quo. And so they tend to push Jokowi for additional presidential term. That's it.
Okay, well, thank you so much. We've come to the end of our time. I just wanted to say it's been a privilege to have you give us the update on the political situation in Indonesia, and all the best with your future research. And thank you, everybody, for joining in on our presentation now. Coming up next will be a presentation on the political update in Cambodia. So thank you.
Thank you to Sarah. Thank you for having me. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.